My name is Junyi, and I'm from Khazanah Research Institute in Malaysia. And today I am presenting about the human rights dimension of AI. I'd like to start with first with this beautiful illustration of a beautiful document. As we all know, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I thought that even though everyone's really familiar with this, possibly we still should be reminded of all of these things that we have as aspirations, as rights that we have as humans. Of course, we can go have a look at the actual document, but then, I wanted to start this off just to, so that we know what we're talking about when we talk about human rights. So the next thing that I wanted to introduce, which I think is quite important, is this, which is the key components of AI. I had been invited to talk about the human rights dimension of automated data processing and collection. But I think it's one thing is that we should really be looking at AI because that's where the biggest effects will be, and that's where we're headed towards. And so this particular diagram shows the 5 main components of AI. And this is really important to know because I think that a lot of our discussions don't actually look at the contextual part. As you can see here in this diagram, people and planet is in the center. We always want to make sure that we're using the technology to benefit the users of the system, to benefit the non-users of the system even, and of course our planet, which at the moment is not in such a great state right now, and lots can be done with technology if we do it the right way. So the other thing that we should be looking at is the economic context of the application of the AI. So to give you an example, an application in the finance sector would be very different with the healthcare sector. They're all like both important sectors, and AI will have huge impacts on people within, but in different ways, which is why it always makes me really confused when not confused, but when we talk about ethical implications of AI in a very broad and abstract manner, it doesn't really mean anything because before you apply it onto a context, you're just talking, in the air. So then, of course, we have the data and input part, where the machine learning, which is AI that we're referring to, will learn from past data and whatever data that you input into it to generate the results that you want. So data is a really important component that will affect human rights. And then there is the AI model, the algorithm that's creating an algorithm in itself. And that's where we talk about explainability, about accountability, transparency, privacy, and all of that generally falls under this as well. So it is very important. And lastly, the task and the output. What are we trying to do with the AI model and the data? This includes, like, for instance, face recognition in the recognize thing, personalization, which is basically, for instance, Facebook or any sort of recommending thing like Amazon and all of that. What is the goal of the system, and what are we optimizing for? That's the task and the output of it. So taking all of this together, do we consider the human rights impacts of AI? So I'm gonna talk about it a little bit more in this following slide. And this is actually from a paper from 2018. I think it was from Berkman and Klein Center, something, yeah. So in any case, the researchers basically went into 6 use cases, and they plotted out the different human rights impacts, as you can see in the diagram on the right. And so you have all of the 30 rights on the right, and then you have these use cases on the left. And all of those lines, they have three colors. The blue is positive human rights impact, the yellow is human rights impact indeterminate, and then the red is the negative human rights impact. And as you can see very clearly with the color codes, a case study within the criminal justice system and a case study in healthcare, for instance, or online content moderation, whichever of these six, and of course many others that you choose, the context really matters. And it matters on different types of rights. And on the left, I've also condensed some of the points from Russo et al. That basically we need to consider economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as the civil and political rights, because I think that a lot of our discussion actually go more towards the civil and political rights. For instance, freedoms of expression, of assembly, and all of that. And we don't look enough at the impacts on economic, social, and cultural rights. So the other thing that we need to consider is that there will be positive and negative impacts on human rights, and they are usually not distributed equally. There are going to be winners and there are going to be losers, and sometimes it's in the same use case. When you try to discern, who is more deserving of social protection, for instance, someone's gonna lose out while somebody else gains. And systems can be accurate and unfair at the same time. I think that this is fairly important because a lot of times we're always talking about creating better technology. Technology itself is neutral, but no, that's not completely true. Because it can be accurate, it can be very well functioning, but if it's being used for a purpose that's unfair, that will result in an unfair system. So this connects to the next point, which is that social institutions that use the technology are not rights neutral. So when we talk about social institutions, who are the power holders, the state, the market, corporations, the people, who are we talking about when we talk about technology users, and what are the contexts? So lastly, as I have mentioned, it's important to look at the use cases in their application context. So I took out this quote from the same paper, which I thought was quite important, which is that they believe, and I also believe, that it is important to recognize that AI systems are not being deployed against a blank slate, but rather against the backdrop of social conditions that have complex pre-existing human rights impacts of their own. And as I will discuss later on, being located in the global south or in developing contexts is really important to look at the power holders and look at where the AI systems are being deployed and look at the spatial and temporal dimensions of where we are, and then judge if it's actually human rights friendly or not. So as the quote goes further, human rights impacts, both positive and negative, may be misattributed to AI, so contributing to the extreme claims of optimists and pessimists alike about the extent to which AI is changing our lives. So I think that that's very important to emphasize. So at the same time, of course, I would just like to highlight with this slide that privacy is often one of the losing rights that we have, as in one of the rights that are easily violated in the context of AI. And here we can see that the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights urges Elon Musk to ensure that Twitter respects human rights And Elon Musk, a self-professed free speech absolutist, is trying to verify everyone, authenticate all humans. And this will have an outsized consequence on those people who do rely on anonymity on Twitter and social media to avoid being prosecuted and being safe. So I don't want to downplay all of these things that are like, for instance, privacy or freedom of expression that will be affected by AI disproportionately and often in negative ways. So this section, I'd like to bring forth some considerations from the Global South. And of course, with the use of the Global South here, it's just a convenient kind of catch-all for countries that are in the developing context, but fully recognizing that China is also part of the Global South, yet is one of the AI superpowers. So take that with a pinch of salt. So I had found this from this paper from Sambasivan et al. To be really important. And this is taken actually ad verbatim from their paper. And it's saying that, for instance, in the US, face recognition at times have been challenged successfully with bans and moratoria. And this is because of these certain points. For instance, there are like scientific empiricism on proxies and scales, and this is about data that they collect, right? And then secondly, there is all of these public data sets, APIs, Freedom of Information Acts that are available to researchers to analyze model outcomes. They have an AI research or industry that is fairly responsive to bias reports from civil society and users. And this is really, as we know from Facebook's whistleblowers time and again, that countries that are not considered as, you know, high priority privileged are often just, you know, just forgotten or just being downgraded in importance when we talk about hate speech or when we talk about electoral interference and things like that. Whereas countries in the West, in the North, are more likely to have action taken upon these problems if they have these problems, when they have these problems. So there are institutions, for instance, government representatives and capacity for technology policy and all of this. Not that, you know, it works all the time or even most of the time, but still there's the existence of these institutions where that is fairly lacking in our context in the Global South. And there's also, for instance, an active media that scrutinizes and reports on the impacts of AI systems, which we in the Global South do not necessarily have. So I just wanted to emphasize with this slide that we really are more vulnerable to the negative impacts of human rights in the AI context. And here I would also like to emphasize, for instance, that a lot of us are in countries which have strong states and who are the strong states can be authoritarian, can be police states. And so we have also that to consider. I mean, of course, global North countries have also that sometimes. But I just want to emphasize that in the South or in Southeast Asia, let's say, we have governments that can, with the reason of national security, use AI for particularly invasive kind of purposes. So here actually is, I think, kind of my last slide. And I just want to put forth this idea that we really need to consider AI to have global governance on AI with an emphasis on vulnerabilities in the global south. And this is basically to reiterate what we had talked about, for instance, in this particular slide, on the context, right? So all of these elements have to be considered, but particularly the context. And what do I mean from context? Like, for instance, our past of our colonial past, for instance, or our being mostly the users rather than the producers of AI, and how data has been kind of hoovered up without much oversight and all of that. A lot of different things to consider, of course, within the global south, and those really need to be looked at. And when you look at, for instance, ethical AI or AI ethical principles, we really do not, like a lot of those principles really do not take into account the context. Instead, they're talking more about principles in the air, let's say, and not even looking at the specific types of applications, not to mention where they're being applied. So I think that that's really quite important to consider. The context of the global south and how we're more vulnerable. And countries in the global south, civil society in the global south, academics and all that, we also need to be proactive and consider meaningful participation in rules making and standard setting and basically making alliances, for instance, with those in the global north and others in the global south as well, to find out how we can actually influence governance of AI, especially when most of the AI come from just a handful of countries with an outsized influence and impact on the rest of the world. So, which is to say, a lot of our countries have, for instance, national strategies and local aspirations to catch up with the AI race. But without the sort of competitive advantage that the AI superpowers like the US and China have, for instance, like swaths of high quality data, good, talent, computing power, and lots of resources in general, we're gonna really have to think not only about rapid adoption of the technology, which a lot of our governments are actually doing, but also to consider the security risks, the AI risks in general. When I say security, I mean actually broadly speaking, not national security, but also in other ways that, for instance, covers sustainability or human rights, or for instance, ESCR rights and all of that, economic rights being a dimension. All of those have to be considered, and we really need meaningful participation in the global south in order to really get the benefits of AI and minimize the bad parts, the risks. And also, just like one thing to consider, sometimes we also need to be quite critical about if we need certain technologies, if the risks outweigh the benefits. So, for instance, in the EU, they have the EU AI Act, and they do take a risk-based approach. And I think that this is something that probably other countries will also have to consider, because sometimes the risks are way too high, and sometimes in the context of our own countries, with local context of racial and religious fault lines and things like that, we need to really consider in context if we sometimes need or have the necessity of certain technologies which might be more risky than beneficial. So I think I'm kind of at the end of my presentation, and these are some of the references. As you can see, this like it's a little bit empty towards the end. But yeah, I thank you for your attention. If there's any questions or comments, I would love to receive your feedback at this email address. Thank you very much.